All right, I want to do a short addendum to part two to connect what we are doing with some popular religious terms. I want to make sure that we're distinguishing between our approach and some preconceived notions that may come into this discussion about religion from previous experience. And so in the previous video, we broke up believers into four categories, from simple and systematic and from fixed to fluid. And it was suggested that the majority of believers are going to exist somewhere around the center of this quadrant system. So if we were to overlay a heat map or a density map on top of this quadrant system, it would look something like this, in which the majority of believers are going to exist somewhere around that origin or the intersection between these two axes. And this may or may not be your experience, but recall we are examining this and analyzing this from the lens of an economist. And we like to distinguish between what people say, or their stated preference, and what people do, which is their revealed preference. And so we'll look at the difference between stated religion and revealed religion. So in a revealed religion, we're looking at how people overcome selfishness and evil, how people overcome death, and how people break the cycle of retribution or evil. We're looking at different strategies. And also, as we'll look at the prisoner's dilemma of exchange, there's really only a few strategies that can solve that prisoner's dilemma of exchange problem. And so people may be switching back and forth in terms of these fluid believers, back and forth at different times of their life or even at different times of the day, using these different religious strategies to overcome the selfishness and evil and to make decisions. And so that's their revealed religion, how they're actually acting and using specific strategies that we'll be talking about. And that may differ between what people state their religion to be. And so the difference between stated and revealed preference is a significant way in which economists are going to view this. And one thing I want to make sure that we understand when we're viewing religion and categorizing believers into it. So we're not talking about doctrines here. We're not talking about specific religious doctrines. We're looking at religious strategies that are being employed and that are being used to overcome selfishness and evil. Let's look at some popular terminology in our context. We could start down here in the systematic and fixed believers. And here we have, maybe in a more popular way, the conservative believers. We've got conservative Christians, conservative Muslims. We also could use Orthodox terminology here, Orthodox Jews, traditionalists or traditional believers. So we've got that kind of popular terminology down here in the pious category. So moving over here into the principled believers, we've got simple and fixed believers. So they're following one religion but not in a systematic way. And so all of their decisions are not being filtered through the religious system. And so there's going to be a larger difference between what they say they believe and their actions, but yet in one religion. And so here you might call these people hypocritical or hypocrites, especially if they're religious leaders and their actions and their revealed preference don't line up. And so we have the hypocrites over here, might be a more popular term. So let's move up into the fluid, simple believers. So these people, again, are looking for answers, and they're looking across religions, but not in a systematic way. And therefore, these people may be called liberal Christians or liberal Muslims or liberal believers. They're not systematically following one religion, and they're more free and open to other ideas. And so here you may look at terminology here up in the liberal view. So let's look at the systematic and fluid believers. Here you've got believers who are following multiple religions or multiple strategies, switching back and forth between those strategies, but in a very systematic way. So they're filtering most of their beliefs through a religious system, but not one religion or one religious system. And so these may be called heretics or heretical people. They're systematic, they're very devout, but they're not constrained to just one system of thought or one problem-solving technique. And so they may, in a more mainstream way, be called heretical believers. So let's take this one step farther and examine this systematic and fluid believers, because these people up here are going to be your religious entrepreneurs when they get pushed further up into the right. And so they're very devout, but they're kind of mixing and matching religious strategies to come up with new religions. And so a lot of these religious founders were heretics in their time. right? Jesus, Muhammad, these people were persecuted in their time, as they were considered heretics, as they were kind of looking at new ways to solve these problems of humanity using religious techniques. So moving down here into the systematic and fixed believers, the further down and to the right we go, these are the people who are maintaining those religions, maintaining that singular religion, either from a practical perspective in terms of the clergy, or from a theological, intellectual, philosophical perspective in the theologians. And so these are the religious leaders who are maintaining that religious system. However, sometimes these religious leaders, theologians and clergy, or gurus down here, may actually start new religions themselves by either coming up with a slight modification, a new way of looking at it, a new technique, a new approach, but those wouldn't necessarily be full-fledged religious entrepreneurs and starting these new main branches off that world religions tree. But this is where denominations or sects come from, right? Where these clergy, these religious leaders, these theologians take a slight modification, right, in which they're not considered heretics in that sense, but they have a slight modification and then have a following after that to create a new religion or a new denomination, a new smaller branch off that world religions tree. And so that's how denominations and sects are made from these one religions that are then continually being divided into smaller and smaller amounts as those modifications are being made through those clergy and those gurus and those theologians. And so here we connected some modern religious terminology with our context and our terminology to kind of maintain the same ideas going forward. And so again, in the next video, we'll look at power and how these believers use power, but I want to make sure that we are kind of speaking the same language and using the terminology in the same way, as religious terminology comes in with a lot of preconceived notions based upon some previous experience.